Nobel Prize economist Milton Friedman once said, "There is one and only one social responsibility of business: to use its resources and engage in activities designed to increase its profits so long as it stays within the rules of the game," which is to say, engages in open and free competition without deception or fraud. If you want to play in the game of business, you have to play by the rules. And in business, the rules of the game are the laws and regulations you have to follow to keep your doors open. I once had lunch with a billionaire who told me there's not a single thing that you can do in business that the government isn't regulating you on. He didn't seem too happy about that, but he runs a global conglomerate that has to employ an army of lawyers and advisors to know what the rules are. His rule book is very complex. And as an entrepreneur, you won't have the luxury of having a staff of attorneys. You'll have to follow the rules mostly on your own. Now, that sounds daunting, doesn't it? Well, it's not as hard as it seems, because your rule book is much smaller than the one that billionaire had to follow. You don't need that many legal experts on your side. A good general attorney, an intellectual property attorney, a reliable accountant, and a dependable insurance agent ought to cover it for you. One of the first decisions you'll have to make when starting a business is what type of legal structure you want your business to have. This decision will have an impact on almost every aspect of your business: how much you pay in taxes, how much risk you take, and how you take on that risk, how you raise money, and even how much paperwork you have to do. You see, you want to be sure you pick the right business structure to meet the needs of your business. So, we're talking about the rules of the game, because whatever business structure you choose will determine which rules you have to follow. Now, when you hear the phrase rules of the game, what do you think of? Well, one thing that I think of when I hear about rules of the game is a board game. You see, board games are a lot like business. When you think about it, you're competing against other people. And there's some decision making that takes place as you try to come out ahead. But the rules define what that game is. Without the rules, it would be a free-for-all. The rules keep everything moving along. One board game that I think is a good metaphor for how the rules of business work is Monopoly. Now, why is that? Well, it's about business, and it takes a long time to come out on top. When the players start the game, they all think they have a good chance of winning. But as the game plays out, some get real rich and others go broke. Some of it's in their hands, and some of it happens by chance. And you know, when you think about it, that seems like a really good fit to me. So let's take a look at the rules of the game and choosing your legal structure through the lens of the Monopoly game. When you start the game of Monopoly, one of the first things you do is pick which token you want to be. Now, some of the tokens I remember are the thimble, the iron, the top hat, the race car, the dog, and the wheelbarrow. These are the pieces the players move around the board. Everyone recognizes you by that token. Well, in the game of business, the token that everyone recognizes you by is your company's legal form of organization, or what's also known as your business structure. When you form your company, you need to decide if you want to be a sole proprietorship, a partnership, a corporation, a limited liability company, or a nonprofit. There are a few other options we'll mention, but these are the most common ones. I don't know about the games of Monopoly that you played, but when I played with my family, nobody wanted the thimble. I mean, it was the last piece chosen. It was boring. A thimble? Really? How did the inventors of the game come up with that one, right? Well, in entrepreneurship, the thimble is the sole proprietorship. A sole proprietorship is simply a business that is completely owned and operated by one person, and they report all their income and taxes on their personal tax return. A sole proprietorship happens when a person decides to sell something so they get whatever local and state licenses they need to be in business. They sell their products, and the money they make is later reported on their personal taxes. In other words, the business becomes a source of income for the person. Pretty simple, right? That's why so many people do it. And if one person owns and operates a business, they might consider this a good option. In addition to a few tax benefits, another reason why people choose this structure is because it guarantees they have complete control over their business. They make all the decisions. This business structure works well if you're an independent contractor who isn't on an employer's payroll, if you're a salesperson working only on commission, or if you're a freelance writer or a photographer, these types of things. Although sole proprietorships are very popular, very few business experts actually advise a startup to take this form. And from a business standpoint, it's as boring as the thimble. Because like a thimble, sole proprietorships lack sophistication. It doesn't signal to the customer or potential investors that you're a credible business. And the sole proprietor option is not without its downsides. The law recognizes no difference between the business and the owner. In other words, the business and the owner are considered to be one and the same. So that means there's unlimited liability on the part of the entrepreneur. If someone sues the business, that means they're suing the owner too. And if the plaintiff wins, they can go after the personal assets of the entrepreneur. You could lose everything you own, and that's a pretty scary proposition for many people. More knowledgeable business people don't recommend taking this kind of risk. Now, the next piece of monopoly that no one wanted was the iron. Another boring piece, right? Well, in business, the iron is the partnership arrangement, and it's just a step up from the sole proprietorship. The key difference is that a partnership is comprised of two or more people in the business. Now, there are two main types of partnerships: general partnerships and limited liability partnerships. So let's talk about general partnerships first. A general partnership has many of the same principles of a sole proprietorship, except you share the ups and downs with someone else. In general partnerships, the partners help manage the company and they assume responsibility for the company's debts and other obligations. Plus, a partner can chip in on some of the cost of starting and running the business. You'll also have a partner to turn to for ideas and support. You do have to split the revenues with somebody else, but most people don't have a problem with that if their partner is helping out. And if the business gets sued, you split the damages with your other partner too. So you're not dealing with the ups and downs of business alone. Each partner reports partnership income on their own individual tax returns. The business doesn't pay any taxes as its own entity. This is called a pass-through entity, and it simply means the partnership itself doesn't pay taxes. Instead, the income passes through the business to each partner. They pay their share of the taxes individually. Now, partnerships can be a great idea when multiple people are entering a business together and they qualify for some great tax benefits. They're definitely worth looking into, and it might make a lot of sense for your business. After all, who wouldn't want to make running a business more fun by working with friends or people you trust? You'd think that friends would make great business partners, right? Well, not always. Because keep in mind, things can go drastically wrong with partnerships. Businesses, in fact, can often strain a friendship. It's one thing to talk about what movie you want to go see together over the weekend, and it's an entirely different thing to make business decisions together. The truth is, people often act differently when there's money involved. Let me tell you a story of a friend of mine who told me about this last week. I'll call him Phil. Phil was an experienced businessman who had mentored a young man in his neighborhood. We'll call that young man Jim. And Jim worked hard as an engineer at a local manufacturing plant. When Jim had saved up enough money, he went to Phil and said he'd like to pursue a business opportunity with him. They didn't know what they wanted to open, but after doing some research, they decided to buy a few food franchises. And Phil was always looking for a good business opportunity, and Jim wanted to learn about being an entrepreneur from Phil, and it looked like a good deal for both of them. They both put in half of the capital needs and decided they'd do a 50-50 partnership. The franchises were doing really well, So well, in fact, that the investors approached Phil about buying their franchises to add to their own portfolios. Again, Phil was always looking for a way to make a buck. After running the numbers, Phil decided it was a great deal and decided they should go forward. The only problem was that Jim really liked owning those restaurants. He found it very satisfying to be a business owner in the community, and the restaurants were bringing in a second source of income. He didn't want to sell the restaurants. And since they were both 50-50 partners, legally, it takes each to agree to sell before it can be done. But Phil really wanted to sell the restaurant to the investor while the iron was hot. So he decided to look for legal loopholes to get around the partnership. And after he talked to his lawyer, he found a possible loophole. Since Phil is president of the company, he thinks that he can cast the deciding vote to break the tie. Now, will that work? I don't know. The courts will have to decide that. What he's hoping will happen is that the mere presence of a lawsuit will induce Jim to go along with the sale. Now, this sounds pretty horrible, doesn't it? Think about it. Two friends ending up in court over what could be a wonderful business opportunity. Well, it happens more often than you think with partnerships. They often start out with the best of intentions, and then they end up in big fights. I've seen it happen many times. If you want to see a good documentary that captures a similar situation, watch Startup.com. It's a cautionary tale of what happens when two friends run a business without clearly defined roles and responsibilities. The documentary follows two best friends as they quit their day jobs and start an internet company. They're very bright, but their coordination of company operations is very sloppy. The documentary follows the entire arc of the company's history, and in the end, the company goes bankrupt. And it goes further than that. Friendship is permanently strained. After watching it, you'll see why other forms of business organization are preferred. So, the options I've outlined so far are the least popular among business experts. So, what are the other options? Well, the other kind of partnership is a great option, and it's called the limited liability partnership. In a limited liability partnership, the limited partners don't get involved in the management of the company, and they don't share the same liabilities as general partners. They act only as investors, and that's all. Think of this business structure as the top hat. In the old days, top hats were worn by professionals, and that's exactly who the LLP is geared towards, professionals. The LLP is popular with businesses like accounting and law firms. It works a lot like a partnership, except if someone is sued in the firm, that person is the only one liable for covering those damages. You can see why accountants and lawyers love this format. They like the advantages of sharing office space and advertising. These are definitely advantages, sometimes that come with partnering with others. But at the same time, if a client sues the firm for malpractice, the offending professional is the only one who has to pay. The next option you might consider is a limited liability company. The limited liability company works in a similar way as a limited liability partnership. I don't know about when you played Monopoly, but the most popular piece when I did was the race car. I mean, what's not to like about a race car? It's really cool. Well, in today's startup world, the limited liability company is the race car. It's very cool with knowledgeable entrepreneurs. When I visited with local economic development officers recently, they told me that 99% of the companies they advise start out as LLCs. Why is the LLC so popular? Well, one thing is that it's just about as simple to run as a sole proprietorship or a partnership. It's not very complicated. You can apply for LLC status online in most states. It's not very expensive to do, and you can get the paperwork done in a mere few minutes. You can have one or more people as members of the LLC, and revenue is taxed just like in a sole proprietorship or a partnership. So if it's not that much different than a sole proprietorship or a partnership, why don't more people do it? Well, for one thing, the LLC is treated as a separate entity from the owner. The business and owner are not considered one and the same in the eyes of the law. So, the owner has some limited liability if someone sues the company. It gives the benefits of a sole proprietorship or partnership, which what I mean by that is it's easy to understand. And there are tax benefits, but you also have some of the protection against personal liability without jumping through all the hoops that you have to when you have a corporation. It's also an easy way to look more professional. Being an LLC gives the impression that you're taking your business more seriously. You're not just selling goods and services, you're savvy enough to be aware of the legal risk involved in sole proprietorships and partnerships. It gives you more credibility. Now, after the race car, the next most popular piece on the Monopoly board, for most people I know, is the dog. I mean, who doesn't like dogs? Well, the dog in business is the corporation format. And like a dog, it's reliable and trustworthy. The corporation is an old favorite of the business world, and for good reason. Now, when people think of a corporation, they often think of a huge empire, of a business, rather than a small business. But this isn't really what they are. A corporation is more complex and more expensive than other business structures, but it doesn't automatically mean that you have to become Apple or Dell to be one. You see, a corporation is the most sophisticated business organization because the law recognizes it as its own person. The stockholders are seen as separate from the corporation. So the corporation pays its own taxes, and then shareholders pay taxes on the dividends that they earn from owning those stocks. It also means that if someone sues a corporation, the stockholders are protected. Additionally, the transfer of ownership is pretty easy through the selling of stocks. And because corporations have stocks, funds can often be raised by issuing more. Corporations are set up to grow and make money. Now that sounds pretty good, doesn't it? But the downside of corporations is that they're often more complicated than the other forms. There are more regulations, taxation, and reporting requirements than on the sole proprietorships, partnerships, limited liability companies, and limited liability partnerships. But if your company starts taking off one day, you might consider turning it into a corporation. Corporations can handle size better than the other forms. Now, what about nonprofits? Let's make the nonprofit the wheelbarrow. Wheelbarrows remind me of helping out your neighbor, and nonprofits are capable of accomplishing some really great things. Most are designed to offer a benefit to people who need it. They can be set up to do charitable work, they might have a religious affiliation, or they might support educational or scientific programs. There are a wide range of nonprofit organizations with a wide range of goals. Unlike for-profit organizations, they often qualify for big tax exemptions like property tax, income tax, and sales tax. They're also very unlike for-profit organizations because all the money they make goes towards paying off their bills or it's reinvested in the company. Since they often receive tax-exempt status, they also aren't allowed to engage in certain types of activities. For example, they're not supposed to get involved with political campaigns. So, that's the thimble, the iron, the top hat, the race car, the dog, and the wheelbarrow of business. The sole proprietorship, the general partnership, the limited liability partnership, the limited liability company, the corporation, and the nonprofit. But here's the good news about business. Everyone can pick whatever token they want. And again, in today's world, the limited liability company is the race car you'll probably want to look into starting. In fact, think of the dog, the race car, and the top hat as the best tokens on the board. That would be the corporation, the limited liability company, and the limited liability partnership. When you're thinking about which token you're going to choose, a common approach is to think first about how you want to shoulder risk. I say everyone can pick whatever token they want, but this is the big question you want to answer. How do you want to shoulder risk? That's the personal liability of owners for business debts. Your business structure will determine how that's handled. So, that's the toolkit item for today. Determine your business structure. To do this, you should look at businesses that have business models similar to yours. Look at how other businesses in the industry are structured. Think about what resources you have and how you're going to run your business. How do you want to handle big decisions, big risk, and big profits? Now, with regard to your token, you'll need to follow a few more rules. You have to spruce up your token by filling out a few forms. In particular, you'll need to file for a Federal Employee Identification Number, or what's also known as an EIN. You can get this number by going to ein-gov.us. It only takes a few minutes, and it's something you have to do. After all, the government wants to make sure it gets its share of that fortune that you're going to make one day. And you may also find that certain customers will ask for you to provide your EIN when you do business with them. Okay, so now you have your token and you want to get the game going. What are the rules you'll need to play by? Well, do you remember the objective of the game of Monopoly? It was to go around buying up property and building up an empire. You might want to do the same thing. And if you do, there will be some rules that you're going to have to follow. When you have property, you'll need to address the following issues. When you have something valuable, you're probably going to have to insure it. Typically, there are common types of insurance that you'll need as an entrepreneur, such as auto insurance, fire insurance, workers' compensation insurance, and public liability insurance. You're probably already familiar with the first two types of insurance. But the other two types of insurance cover unexpected events that can hurt your business. Think of workers' compensation and public liability as the chance cards in Monopoly. You remember those, right? Those were the cards that tried to bring the uncertainty and risk of the real world into the game. Well, unexpected crises can happen to any business, and you have to be prepared for it. Workers' compensation insurance protects you from incurring too much loss if one of your employees hurts themselves on the job. Now, if you've ever managed people, you know that people are very, very unpredictable. Just go to YouTube and type in dumbest job accidents to see what I mean. Public liability insurance protects you from many of the unexpected crises that come from being in the business world. It assists you with lawsuits regarding visitor accidents on your property, injuries using your products, and business disputes. We're fortunate that we have these types of insurance, otherwise things could get pretty out of control. A good insurance agent can help you shop around for good policies that will fit your company. Now, there was another set of cards in Monopoly called Community Chest. These are the cards that bring another degree of complexity to the game. Well, your real-life community may do the same to you as an entrepreneur. Remember that billionaire I talked about earlier? He said that everything he did was regulated. Well, you might face some of the same restrictions too. There's a good chance that if you're making something or have a physical location, you'll have to follow worker safety guidelines like those provided by OSHA. And you'll need to make sure your facilities meet ADA requirements. Don't let these things sneak up on you, because you're going to have to look into it early, because if you have to fix it later, it can be a lot harder to deal with when you're up and running. There's also a good chance your industry may be regulated by the government as well. I advise you to talk with other people in your prospective industry to find out which licenses and certifications you need to go into business. You might also have to follow some environmental guidelines too. The EPA has a helpful website that can help you with this. And speaking of government regulations, remember those properties you own? Well, there might be people actually working in them. So that'll bring another batch of laws and regulations that you'll have to follow. This used to be a bit overwhelming for the small business owner, but it's gotten a lot easier with the internet. If you go to the U.S. Department of Labor's website, you'll find their very handy e-laws guide. By answering questions on their website, it will walk you through what you'll need to have to be in compliance with labor. The e-laws guide can get you up to speed on such expectations as federal income tax withholding, state income tax withholding, Medicare taxes, and Social Security taxes. Okay, so that's a lot of talk about licenses, permits, and governmental regulations. But just like in Monopoly, you have to play by the rules. If you don't abide by them, you might have to go to jail, and you don't get to pass go, and you definitely don't get to collect $200. We want to keep your token on the board. But what makes Monopoly so much like real life is that sometimes players do go bankrupt. In Monopoly, this happens when the player can't cover what they owe someone. They have to sell off everything, and they got to cover their debt. Well, that's sort of how it works in the real world too. Two common types of bankruptcy in business are Chapter 7 and Chapter 11. Chapter 7 works a lot like bankruptcy in Monopoly. When a company files Chapter 7, all assets are liquidated to pay off debts. Now, that sounds pretty harsh, doesn't it? But sometimes it's the only option someone has. Chapter 11 is a little less daunting than Chapter 7. Essentially, Chapter 11 bankruptcy is an opportunity for financially troubled companies to reorganize. It doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to close their doors, but it does have some cleanup work to do. Essentially, the company is making deals with the people it owes to pay them back. Unfortunately, they may not be able to pay back everything they owe. Now, why would creditors go along with this type of arrangement? Well, they want to get whatever money they can get from the company while they can, and that's a lot better than nothing. Still, the courts think the company has potential to turn itself around, so in the interest of the common good, the company is allowed to stay open, regroup, and try again. If the courts approve the reorganization strategy, the company can execute the plan to hopefully turn itself around. It's better for the system if that company doesn't liquidate. Now, in the game of Monopoly, everyone goes bankrupt except the winner. Well, as we've seen, bankruptcy happens a lot in the real world too. And if you start a business, there's no guarantee that you won't go bankrupt either. But this is where the real world is different than Monopoly. Because unlike Monopoly, there can be more than one winner. Others don't have to go bankrupt to win. You know, one more nice thing about playing Monopoly is that if you lose, you get to try again later if you want. Well, you can do the same thing in real business. Bankruptcy doesn't mean you can't play another game in the future. In the real world, you get a chance to regroup too. In fact, many of the most successful entrepreneurs in history went bankrupt early in their careers. Henry Ford, Walt Disney, and Milton Hershey all went bankrupt before they went on to build their great fortunes. They hadn't figured out their formulas of success yet, but they all credit their bankruptcies as times they learned a lot about how to build a business. You know, it's really the same in today's world. Some startup experts in entrepreneurial communities see bankruptcy as a good thing. You see, they see it as a chance for new entrepreneurs to learn some difficult yet valuable lessons. I've even heard some investors say they don't even look at potential deals unless that entrepreneur has experienced a failure at some point in their life. The thinking is that if someone hasn't failed, well, that just means they haven't taken enough risk in their life, that they've played it too safe. Of course, I'm guessing those investors would prefer the entrepreneurs not fail when they're using their own money. So that's the game of business. In today's lecture, we looked at the legalities involved in playing that game. This can be an overwhelming topic for some people. There seems to be so much to it. But just like you were able to read the instructions of a board game when you were a kid, you can learn the basics of meeting the laws and regulations of business too. But you don't have to do this alone. With trusted advisors and local economic organizations, you can learn enough to get started. As your business gets bigger, the laws are going to become more complex. But if that happens, that's a good thing because that means you've become more successful. And as you become more successful and you make more money, you can afford to hire more legal and financial professionals who can help you learn all those rules. Don't worry. Picking up that legal knowledge will come naturally as you grow. So, for now, focus on the rules you need to know to get in the game, put out the best product or service you can, and make your customers happy. If you do that, you're going to win at the game of business.